Hi everyone, and welcome to our 8th lesson in our An Inspector Calls GCSE revision series. If you haven't watched any of the videos so far, basically what we're doing is we're going through all the key characters, the key themes, the quotes for those characters and themes that you need, model answers and model paragraphs, as well as some context, basically giving you the whole toolkit of what you need to be successful in your upcoming GCSE exams. So if that seems like something useful to you, please stay tuned. In the last few weeks, we have been going through a lot of characters, really, because there's lots of important characters in An Inspector Calls. So we went through Mr. Burling, we went through Eric, we went through Eva, Inspector, Gerald, Mrs. Burling, Sheila. And now today, finally, we are going to start looking at some themes together. So we're actually going to start not with capitalism versus socialism, although there'll be hints of that. We're going to start with class division. So that's what we'll be looking at. So if you haven't seen any of those videos beforehand, I highly recommend them. If you're sitting this exam this year or even next year, it's good to get a head start. So we're going to be looking at class division, and I guess I'll just put myself here as an impoverished person with my hat out. I don't know, I always move around the camera, it's stupid. I'll just leave it up there. So loads of quotes on class division. Once we've gone through some of those quotes, analyzed them a bit, thought about them a bit, then as usual at the end of the lesson I'll be doing a model paragraph with you. So there are loads. I might not manage to get through all of these quotes in this time, but I'll do my best to get through as many as I can. So let's get started. Perhaps I ought to warn you that he's an old friend of mine. A little typo there. Sorry, let me just sort that out because that's going to annoy me. There we go. He's an old friend of mine. So this is very near the start of Arthur Burling speaking with the inspector. And what Arthur Burling is saying here is that he is friends with the constable of the police station. So what Arthur Burling is trying to do here, this is kind of subtext. He's trying to warn the inspector and basically say, look, I'm good friends with your boss. So tread carefully when you're inspecting me, because otherwise I'll call him. His name is Colonel Roberts, I think it was, and get you fired. Right? So there's class division, because imagine being so wealthy and upper class that you literally know the law enforcement by name and you play golf with them and stuff. So it sort of shows corruption, but it also shows just this gap between the wealthy and the poor. The wealthy know everyone, even the people that are supposed to be upholding the law. Mrs. Burling calls Eva Smith a girl of that class. I think we've spoken about this in previous videos, but it's just very dismissive and patronizing to use the word girl. Eva Smith is a full-grown woman, and up until being fired by Mr. Burling and being fired by Sheila, she paid her bills, and probably on time, right? So calling her a girl is just very patronizing. Again, it shows this division between the classes, the upper class looking down upon the lower class, the working class. If you don't come down hard on these people, they'll soon be asking for the world. So there's this irony to this one. So Arthur Burling claims that the working class are the ones that are asking for the world, even though the truth is that all Eva asked for was like a couple of pennies of a pay rise, right? So she's not asking for the world at all. As a matter of fact, he's the one that's really asking for the world, because he literally says that he wants to be able to lower his costs and raise his prices. So he wants to give even less money to his workers and take even more money from his customers, which shows his greed. And again, it just shows the upper class being very divided from the working class, but very greedy. Yeah. Okay. You think everybody has to look after everybody else, community and all that nonsense. So another quote that would go with this, which I haven't got in this long list, is where Mr. Burling is talking about how they're like, he says how socialists think that we're all bees in a hive, and he says it's nonsense that we're all bees in a hive. So again, it clearly shows class division, because the upper class are basically saying, look, we're above everybody else and we're separate from everybody else. We don't need to build community. That's nonsense. So he doesn't want to have anything to do with the working class. He wants to be divided. He doesn't want community. So, you know, not everybody would think like Mr. Burling. You have to remember that J.B. Priestley, who wrote this play, really hated capitalism. He was staunchly against capitalism. He was very pro-socialism. So obviously the capitalist upper class characters in his play are going to be like the worst version of upper class and capitalism that you could imagine. So that's what's going on there. Gerald says about Eva Smith, she was very pretty, soft brown hair and big dark eyes. Now, this is an interesting one because working class, the way that both Gerald and or Gerald, Eric, and Sheila all talk about, well, and even the inspector all talk about Eva Smith, is often in terms of her looks. And so it's interesting that her value is often placed on the way she looks. And the way that particularly Sheila treats Eva Smith is really bad, because she basically, Sheila basically says, oh, I thought Eva Smith would be able to look after herself because she looked really pretty. So it's this quite odd thing where because she's a good looking woman, they think that she's okay, but that's got nothing to do with whether you're going to survive in a divided class system or not, right? So I think that's a really interesting one, that a lot of her value comes from how she looks and not really anything else. And that's really bad. And maybe it also forebodes the fact that she goes into prostitution, because once she's lost her job at the factory, Burling's factory, once she's lost her job at Millwoods, which is the clothing store, she doesn't have many options as a working class woman at that time at all. So, you know, she's good looking, so she tries to sell her body at that point, which is just awful. We are members of one body, we're responsible for each other. So this one obviously juxtaposes the quote that Burling says. So Burling says community and all that nonsense, so he's dismissing it, whereas the inspector here is saying we are members of one body and we are responsible for each other. Now, this is an interesting quote because I believe that J.B. Priestley was a Christian, and Christians believe in what's called the body of Christ. So, you know, Jesus is at the top, and then all of the Christian people, like they form the body of Christ effectively. So they're also like, it's kind of loosely like the church, right? So they are a community and they look after each other. And I think that might be, if I'm correct about that, which I'm pretty sure I am, that could be another reason why Priestley was quite socialist, because he's saying, look, as Christians, and remember back in, you know, 1940s when this was written, the vast majority of people in England were Christian. It would have been very appealing to be like, look, we're all members of one body together. We're all a big community. We're all responsible for each other. We should look after each other. So it goes against class division, right? This quote. So you got Inspector, who's very socialist and doesn't like class division. And you got Burling and Mrs. Burling and Gerald, who are capitalist, up class, and they want class division. They want to be at the top of the pyramid. Look at the way he talked to me. So Mr. Burling, you know, this is another part of class division. Mr. Burling is offended, and so is Mrs. Burling at a different point, at the way that the inspector speaks to them. So because they're upper class, they believe that the working class shouldn't even dare to speak to them in a certain way, right? Because they're just like above all that in their heads. So the fact that the inspector cuts through all the BS and literally is like, you know, getting angry with them and pushing them and stuff, it totally shakes their world, because they're not used to anyone speaking to them like this ever. And it just throws them off. Mr. Burling, again, flexing. He says, I was an alderman for years and Lord Mayor 2 years ago, and I'm still on the bench. So, you know, once you're a member of the upper class, all the opportunities in the world are right there for you, right? So he was an alderman, he was Lord Mayor, he's on the bench. So there's all this stuff that he has access to, and all this money and wealth and power, and that he's got access to, because he's one of the hases, right? He's one of the people who has. He's not a has not. He's not one of the working class. Imagine a working class person even trying to do some of this stuff at this point. It just wouldn't work. So that also shows corruption, because in a democracy like we have in the UK, the poorest person in our society technically should be able to be our prime minister or our Lord Mayor or our alderman, because it's the people that choose, right? And what Priestley is maybe saying here a bit, again, linking class division with corruption, is the idea that really, even though it's meant to be that way, the truth is that someone like Eva Smith would really struggle to be able to make it, because she doesn't have the money, basically. She doesn't have the money for funding. She doesn't have the money for like flyers and posters and all that kind of stuff. She doesn't have any wealthy friends that could support her, all that sort of thing. And that's definitely a valid point and a problem. You mustn't try to build up a kind of wall between us and that girl. So, Sheila comes right out and says it here, right? She literally says, look, there's a wall. Obviously, it's metaphor, but there's this wall between us and the girl because we're upper class and she's working class. And Sheila is saying, look, stop building that wall up, break that wall down. Class division is a bad thing. He creates at once an impression of massiveness, solidity, and purposefulness. So just the fact that the inspector, even though he's working class or maybe sort of lower middle class, has massiveness, solidity, and purposefulness shows that anyone of any class, as we know anyway, but some people were struggling with this in the 1940s, I guess, have value, right? Clearly, all of the people have value, but it just shows that there's this value, even though he's not upper class, he has this value. And Priestley actually kind of makes the inspector seem much more valuable even than these upper class people, the Burlings and the Crofts and so on. I tell you that the time will come when, if men will not learn that lesson, they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. Good night. So this is a consequence of class division. If you are someone who upholds class division, what Priestley is saying is that it'll end in war and disaster. Now, I don't fully agree with that, but I agree that class division clearly causes tension between the classes. And what Priestley is trying to say here, because remember, he wrote this in 1945. It was first performed in 1945 in Russia, in 1946 in England. But he has set the play in 1912. So he said it before World War I. And so he's basically saying, look, if only we'd listened to people like the inspector, if only we'd become socialist and got rid of class division, then we would have had no world wars. That's what he's saying here. I disagree with it, but I think that there is definitely a point to it that conflict comes from class division. Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us. So this quote is a very famous quote. It shows the extent of the problem. So there are very few people like the Burlings, right? There are very few families and people that are upper class. Let's say it's like famously they call them the 1%, right? Let's say it's the 1%. But, then there's the middle class. I don't know how much that will be. Let's just make up this 10%, right? So 10 or 11% or so of the population are fairly comfortable, right? At this time. Class division means that all of the working class are miserable and uncomfortable, right? So the vast majority, the millions, are uncomfortable and living terrible lives. So again, this is a reason why class division is shown to be quite a big problem in Edwardian society. If there weren't the factories and warehouses, wouldn't know where to, if there weren't, the factories and warehouses wouldn't know where to look for cheap labor. Ask your father. So this is another issue of class division. The fact that the working class don't have many opportunities means that people like Mr. Burling and Lord Croft, who is Gerald's father, can exploit cheap labor, right? So if you're poor, like poor to the point that you don't know where your next meal is coming from, you better believe that you're going to work in a factory for no workers' rights, no money really, just the tiniest bit to just get enough to feed yourself. If you're that desperate that you're dying in the streets, then you're going to do it, right? So that's another problem with class division and the lack of workers' rights. I've got 2 more pages of quotes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do more like a highlight reel now. I'll probably just pick 3 or 4 more. You can always look through all of these on this document. But so I think that the lack of empathy between the working class and the upper class, or the upper class to the working class, is a really big problem. So Sybil Burling, so Mrs. Burling says, I was perfectly justified in advising my committee not to allow her claim for assistance. So the fact that she has no emotions for Eva Smith is literally pregnant and starving. And she's like, well, I was justified in not allowing my committee to help her. There's just this lack of empathy for the working class. And part of the reason for that is the reason I picked this picture. Because imagine that you're that high up and comfortable, and there's this huge gulf down to the working class. You can't even relate to them at that point, really. You can't relate to people so different from you, really. So I think that that's a big reason why she has so little empathy. Also, I just think she's a psycho. Anyway, the other thing is that Priestley tries to show that there are problems in the upper class as well. It's not all sunshine and roses. So Mr. Burling is not a good father to Eric, that's clear. And Sybil Burling is not a good mother to Eric and Sheila either. Both of them are bad parents. So it shows that when you're in the upper class, sometimes just because you've got all the money doesn't mean that you've actually got like you're not a good person, basically. That doesn't make you a good person just because you're in the upper class. So he tries to get rid of some of that positive stereotypes towards the upper class and say, look, they're humans like us, and they actually often make big mistakes. She was pretty, I couldn't feel sorry for her. This is Gerald. So again, this idea that, like I said earlier, Eva Smith's worth is often linked to how she looks. I became at once the most important person in her life. Do you understand? So Gerald here, because he's upper class, immediately becomes like the most important thing to Eva Smith. So imagine again that you're in a position where you're working for pennies a day, barely getting by, and then a millionaire comes along. It's quite easy to see how so much more focus and time would end up going on that relationship because of that. But that's another one of the tragedies. I've spoken about this before. I fully believe that Gerald Croft loved Eva Smith, but he couldn't marry her because of the expectations of the time, because of this huge class divide in society, and because of the views of his parents. His parents would not have allowed him to do this. They'd have disowned him. And if they'd have disowned him, then he would have had no money himself, and then he'd be just as messed up. Then the only other one I think is worth mentioning is just, again, the treatment of the working class. So Gerald set her up as his mistress and then dropped her when it suited him. So Gerald probably treats Eva Smith / Daisy Renton better than anyone else in the play. And yet even he drops her when it suits him, right? So that is not a good thing. So none of them treat the working class properly. He at least gave her a good place to stay and money and food and shelter and all that good stuff. But still, huge divide. It's one of the major themes in the play. So hopefully some of what I just said helps you to know some of the things you could write about it. So in a nutshell, you could talk about class division in terms of, obviously it's very corrosive. It shows the lack of care between the classes. It shows the struggle of the working class, shows the corruption of the society at the time. And it also just shows like how difficult it would be to go from upper class to working class or vice versa, because most of the opportunity is there for the upper class and not really there for anyone else. Okay, so where's the significance of class division in Inspector Calls? I just gave you 4 or 5 things we could write about, but let's write about, I don't even know how the sentence is going to end. Let's see. So one of the major significances of class division in an Inspector Calls is the way in which it highlights the gross corruption within Edwardian society. We see this first when Mr. Burling says, perhaps I ought to warn you that he's an old friend of mine. When speaking about the colonel runs police station. Here, the subtext is clearly an attempt to intimidate the Inspector Gould by letting him know that Mr. Burling is very friendly with his boss. This suggests that the upper class were above punishment and justice for their crimes, since they knew the people enforcing the law and making the law. Similarly, do I want to do similarly or do I want to do something else? I think we'll actually do, what other quote should we do? Yeah. So similarly, class division also creates a lack of opportunity for the working class, which is another form of corruption. See this in the quote. If there weren't the factories and warehouses, wouldn't know where to look for cheap labor. Ask your father. Here the inspector highlights the lack of opportunity for the working class, and therefore corrupt people like Mr. Burley can exploit the system and get a lot of cheap labor. Since the working class would have been desperate even for enough money for food. As the reader or audience, we feel a great deal of pathos. Pathos is just a fancy word for pity. Great deal of pathos for the working class. This is significant because Priestley was a socialist, and this play and much of his life's work was an attempt to convince England to become a socialist country. With some of his broadcasts being so extreme, they were cancelled. I think it was cancelled by the BBC, but I'm not 100%, so I'm not going to put that. But yeah, so he was a very strong socialist. He didn't want class division. He wanted to highlight like the problems with class division, and there certainly are problems. And I think that the problems were probably even worse in the 1940s. And so, yeah, that is a point. Got several bits of evidence which we've analyzed. We've tried to use some techniques. I do feel like maybe I could have used a bit more techniques, particularly with this bit. I'd probably just put short, simple sentence of ask your father highlights the bitter tone that the inspector uses. So don't forget to use language devices in every quote as best you can. I should do that too in my models, obviously. And then we've gone into what the reader would have thought or felt, and also then linking it to some context. So there you go. That's what you got to do. That's a model paragraph for class division in an inspector calls. Hopefully that was helpful. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments, please do leave them down below. And I will see you in the next one. Thank you very much.